What is the core message of your presentation?
So I was addressing the question, why religious freedom? Why should we care about religious freedom? For the seeker of truth, that may be obvious, but what about for someone who believes they have the truth, or for someone who doesn't care about religion, or someone who even believes that religion is a negative force in society? Why should they care about religious freedom? And I was basically providing three reasons that I think are important. The first is that religious freedom is really the taproot of human rights. And I think that if we disregard religious freedom, we're unlikely to have a robust and healthy human rights system or human rights culture. The second reason had to do with the distinction between statism and monism, between dualist and monist views of the state. And so the idea there is that if you really believe in individual human rights and that there are things that the state should not do to you, then you're a dualist. If you think that rights are just something that the state gives us and can take away from us, then you're a monist. And I think that religious thinking and religious views are very important for the sustenance of a dualist state. The third point had to do with conscience. I argue that the idea of conscience really emerges from a religious understanding of conscience, and that without an understanding of the religious sources of conscience, we're unlikely as a society or as cultures to be protective of conscience.
Freedom of religion is a fundamental freedom as defined in both the Canadian Charter and the U.S. Constitution. Does it remain so today in practice?
So I think religious freedom does remain a fundamental freedom. I think if you ask the average person, do you think religious freedom is important, the answer would be yes. There may be disagreement about what some of that means or what its implications are in practice, but I don't think that either in the United States or in Canada there's a widespread sense that religious freedom is unimportant. I think it's more a contest about what does it mean, what are its implications, and what happens when our religious views come into conflict with something that the state wants us to do.
What institutional and societal constraints exist and should be cause for concern?
Well, I think the big cause for concern is the idea that non-discrimination norms and religious freedom are engaged in some sort of a zero-sum game or death struggle. The reality is non-discrimination norms arose in large measure as ways of protecting religious minorities from discrimination by other people. And so what we need to do is to try to find a reconnection between the understanding of non-discrimination norms and the protection of religious minorities. Just as sexual minorities, people of color need to have protections against non-discrimination, religious people need protections against non-discrimination as well. Somehow into the popular consciousness has entered this idea that religion on the one hand and religious freedom is in opposition to non-discrimination norms. If you look around the world, the persecution of religious minorities that we see is strong evidence that non-discrimination is very important for religious people and for religious minorities in particular.
If freedom of religion is a fundamental freedom, can it also be argued to be a foundational freedom?
Yeah, I argue that religious freedom is fundamental and foundational. The metaphor I use is, I think of it as the taproot of the tree of human rights. And if you cut a tree from its roots, the tree is going to wither and die. So if we think about other important fundamental rights, such as the freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of association, each of these rights emerged in large part as a struggle for religious freedom. So freedom of the press was in large measure a fight over the right to print the Bible. Freedom of association was in large measure a fight over the right of dissenting religious groups to meet together, to worship together, to gather together. Freedom of speech in large measure arose as the right of religious people to spread their understanding of the good news. And so each of these basic rights is very closely connected to freedom of religion. And I think we need to reappreciate the importance of religious freedom to all of those basic fundamental rights. Because if it is true that these other rights emerged in some large measure as part of or in conjunction with religious freedom, then the idea that we don't need religious freedom becomes very worrisome, because if you eliminate the taproot, if you eliminate the foundations, if you disregard where our rights and freedoms came from, I'm not sure that we really have the intellectual or cultural resources to preserve those other rights and freedoms.
Freedom of religion, like other freedoms, is understood to be born and exercised first and foremost by individuals. But what about the role of faith communities or faith-based institutions? Do they exercise these freedoms as communities of faithful individuals?
Yeah, so this is a very important dimension of religious freedom, is the collective or the community dimension of it, the corporate dimension of religious freedom. Sometimes we talk about this in terms of religious autonomy, the right of religious groups to direct their own affairs, select their own leaders, determine their own doctrines, decide who is and is not eligible to work as employees of the religious organization. But it has deep roots in the idea of conscience as well. We think of conscience today as largely an individual right, but the rights of conscience really emerged as rights of members of religious groups. And it was those religious groups that had a conscientious view. And so, for example, conscientious objection to military service wasn't first given to individuals as a matter of individual conscience. It was given to members of recognized religious groups that had a doctrinal basis for being opposed to military service, people such as the Quakers, for example. And so the right to conscience emerged from this collective and communal dimension. And so even the idea of community conscience or corporate conscience is sometimes under attack. But I think if we look at the history of the emergence of conscience as a concept, it actually is deeply rooted in this idea of communal conscience, community conscience, and corporate conscience.
How do we ensure, and why must we ensure, the robust exercise of religious freedom within a multi-faith and multicultural society?
A scholar from England named Simon McCrossan has talked about what he calls cut flower culture, which is the idea that we can cut the beautiful rights and freedoms that we enjoy from the roots and imagine that they're going to survive for a long time. And if it is true, and I think it is, that religious freedom is a taproot, one of the taproots of human rights, civil rights, the rule of law, the prohibition on discrimination, then we, at our peril, try to sever that root. And so my view is that understanding, valuing, and protecting religious freedom is a very important part of preserving a legal, political, and cultural commitment to the idea of rights in general.
Any final thoughts?
Well, let me just say in conclusion that I think the Cardus project of trying to create a thoroughfare, a main street through the town where public discussion and discourse can take place is really important. And one thing I find really moving about their vision is that they want to engage with people with whom they agree, but also people with whom they disagree. And it is a vision that's deeply committed to the idea that we can reason together, we can understand each other, we can find solutions to problems together.